Hello, everyone, and welcome to the June broadcast of RELO Andy's webinars. For those of you unfamiliar with the RELO office, it is the Regional English Language Office. We are located at the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru, and the RELO office is in charge of all things having to do with English language programming throughout Spanish-speaking South America. My name is Maggie Steingraber. I am an English language fellow who is based here in Lima. I host and coordinate the webinars, so in the confirmation email that you received, you will see my contact information. So any questions, any feedback that you have, please feel free to email me, and I will get back to you with a response as soon as possible. All right, today's presenter is Rosie David. She is a professor at Unidad del Norte in Barranquilla, Colombia. Rosie, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hello. Could you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're going to be talking about today?
Hello, my name's Rosie, and I am an English language teacher. I've been a teacher trainer, and I've also worked in EFL, ESL, and in international relations. And today we're going to talk about how to support students with learning differences. Okay. So today we're going to talk about how we can support students with learning differences. And we're going to talk about the issues that they may have when they're acquiring the information that happens in an English language class. So we're primarily going to focus on dyslexia, but we'll also talk about a few other learning differences, such as dypraxia, specific language impairment, ADHD, and Asperger's. But this webinar is primarily focused on dyslexia. So as Maggie has shared with you, you're going to need a piece of paper and either a pen or a pencil in about 3 or 4 minutes. So before that, I'm just going to give you an overview of what a learning difference is, and then we'll move forward and do a little activity. So I want to start with a poll, and I want you to imagine what it would feel like to have a learning difference or dyslexia. And I want you to look at these 4 possibilities. Which one of these do you actually think would be difficult for you in a language classroom? Would you A, have a short-term phonological issue with memory, meaning that you have trouble remembering sounds and words? Would you B, have a hard time producing syntactic structures or using grammar rules and grammar structures? C, would you maybe read at a lower speed than other students in the class? Or D, would you possibly have issues with spelling or remembering syllables in words?
All right. Can you see the results, Rosie?
I cannot, but that's okay. Do you want to tell me them?
Sure. So 2% said short-term phonological memory, 22% said producing syntactic structures, 7% said read at slower speeds, 24% said orthography, and then the little help that I gave them was 46% said all of the above.
Yeah, I should have given an E, correct?
Yeah.
Because if you thought it was all the above, you were correct. Because all of those areas are difficult. All of those areas are difficult. Students with learning differences are going to read at lower speeds. They're going to have issues with short-term phonological memory. They may have a disconnect in their phonological memory. They may have problems remembering sounds, or they might confuse sounds that are similar. So these are all issues that we endure when we have a learning difference. So what is a specific learning difference? I want to give you a general definition. So the term specific learning difference refers to a difference or a difficulty students or people have with particular aspects of learning. Now, this definition is very, very general because there are many different learning differences, and in this webinar, we will primarily focus on these. So we'll talk about issues such as having issues acquiring numeracy skills, the acquisition of literary skills like dyslexia, coordination and movement, dypraxia, comprehending and sound producing language, which is specific language impairment, sustained attention, ADHD, and social interaction, which is Asperger's. Now, I think it's really important that when we look at this slide, that we understand that some of these learning differences over, or some of these learning differences coincide together. And when we think about this, we need to remember that about 10% of all of our students in our classroom will have a learning difference. So when you think about this, it means if you have a group of 20 students, 2 of those students will more than likely have a learning difference. It may or may not be diagnosed. And of those 2 students, about 70% of those students will have a co-occurrence, which means they will have issues in other areas. And co-occurrence is very common, but I think when we think about how we're teaching, it's important to remember that SPLDs are learning, or learning differences are blanket definitions. And then when we're teaching, we have to think about ways to support all of our learners, regardless if they have a learning difference or not. So, in order to fully understand the challenges that our students with learning differences may endure in the English classroom, I want you to have an experience like this yourself. I want you to do a simulation with me. So, what do you need to do this? Well, as Maggie said before, you need a piece of paper and either a pen or a pencil. Okay, so you're going to have to take short notes. And I'm going to do this very, very quickly because we don't have a lot of time, and I'm not always the most quote-unquote thoughtful teacher about my students' needs. Ready? So, directions. The first step is you're going to be copying down a text. And when you're copying down this text, you must use the hand that you normally do not write with. So if you are left-handed, you will write with your right hand. If you are right-handed, you will write with your left hand. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Okay. The next is every time you see an E, you will write an upside down E. So every time you see an E on this upcoming text, you will write an upside down E or a schwa. Every time you see an A, you will write an @ sign. Every time you see an A, you will write an @ sign. And every time you see an S, you will write a 5. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes to copy down this text, and then I'm going to check in with you. Are you ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the timer is being set for 4 minutes. Please put down your pen or pencil. Take a deep breath, and I just want you to take a second and reflect on the whole activity. I want you to think about what it felt like to write with your opposite hand that you're used to writing with. I want you to think about the symbols you had to use. I want you to think about the role of the teacher or me as a facilitator and the words and the actions I was using during the activity. And I want you to overall think about how you felt. So please raise your hands if you were able to finish copying the entire text.
One person has risen their hand.
One person. 2.
3.
Wow. 3.
Mm-hmm.
And we have about 64 people in the webinar.
76.
76.
Mm-hmm.
76 people, and about 2 could finish copying the whole text. Interesting. So I want you to take another second or another couple, maybe a minute, and I want you to think about how this activity made you feel physically, emotionally, psychologically, and I just want you to type 1 or 2 words in the text box, and then Maggie will share those answers with me.
Yeah. Frustrated. It felt funny, only able to get a sentence and 2 words. Rushed. Another frustrated. I knew ahead of time it would be difficult. It was not frustrating but helpful. Natalia says disappointed, physically exhausted, I see, sad. You're making people feel bad.
I'm making people feel bad.
Ta says she was so slow, anxious, stressed out, unable, and anxious. Frustrated, quite challenging. It goes on.
So as you can see, having a learning difference, having all these things going against you in the classroom will make you feel all of those ways. It'll make you frustrated. Sometimes it will make you feel like you're not capable of learning. And so as we move forward in this webinar, I want you to keep these ideas in the forefront of your mind, what you just experienced, because a learning difference is generally invisible. We can't see it. We don't know necessarily what is happening with our students. And sometimes when we think about behavioral issues or issues that students are having in the classroom, we cannot see how their learning process is happening. So as we teach, we have to start thinking about how we can scaffold our classroom so that everybody can learn. So these are some of the issues that students may endure in an English language classroom. And these are the linguistic issues. So they may have problems segmenting words into phonological units. They may have problems with word recognition, difficulties spelling. They may have a smaller range of vocabulary, slow word retrieval. They may even have slow speech, problems writing, and also problems keeping verbal material in phonological short-term memory, which means they may understand, for instance, grammar rules, but when it comes time to apply these rules and use them in speech or even in their writing activities, there may be some sort of disconnect that makes it difficult for them to be able to do this. And there's also non-linguistic issues that learners may experience. Now, I want to say that when you look at these lists, they're not all encompassing. These are just some of the areas that students may have problems. But again, they might have a smaller span of working memory. They may have difficulties with handwriting. They might have problems with their motor skills. They may have problems with time management and organization. And they may have a hard time putting those new skills that they're learning into practice. So it's not to say that our students with learning differences, such as dyslexia, learn at a different speed, but they learn a different way. And these are areas that they may have problems. So I want to talk about some strategies to support students with learning differences. I know that's why you're here, and I want to spend some time talking about this. So today we're going to talk a little bit about multisensory teaching methods. We're not going to go into a great depth into this because unfortunately we don't have enough time. But we are going to talk about it a little bit. And we're going to look at strategies to support you as a teacher, but also to support your students as learners. So when you think about multisensory, I want you to think about the idea of multiple intelligences or different learning styles, because the goal behind multisensory teaching is to develop an L2 learner's syntactic, morphological, and phonemic awareness. And the idea is we have to build pathways in between visual, kinesthetic, tactile, and auditory pathways. So the idea is to scaffold learning where we're focusing on different learning styles as we teach. And by doing this, students are able to counterbalance their problems and succeed inside the classroom. Also, students who learn this way are able to see how they learn, and this helps them articulate to their teachers what areas they feel that they succeed in and what areas the teacher can help them succeed. So I built this little diagram because I figured some of us are visual learners, right? So the idea is that by connecting all these pieces, all these different pathways, we're able to build awareness in the classroom. So we're not just talking about language, but we're actually talking about how we can demonstrate different ways of learning and interacting with knowledge. Now, we're really lucky as language teachers because we get to incorporate all these pieces with a few other skills that we often focus on in our classroom, or we have been taught that we should focus on in our classroom. So what are those 4 skills that we usually focus on when we're teaching a foreign language? Let's do another poll.
The poll is open, so again, you can click right on your screen for which of the 3 options. It is option 1, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, spelling. Option 2, listening, speaking, writing, reading. Option 3, phonetics, syntax, morphology, pragmatics. I'll share the results. We have 3% said grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, spelling. 79% said listening, speaking, writing, reading. 17% said phonetics, syntax, morphology, and pragmatics.
So if you said B, you should pat yourself on the shoulder because you are correct. However, all of those answers, all 3 of those categories are obviously important when we're teaching, but we're talking about the skills. So listening, speaking, writing, and reading. So that's what we're going to focus on for the next 10 to 15 minutes in this webinar. So first we're going to start with listening. So one thing that you need to be aware of is that students with learning differences generally have a hard time telling the difference between similar sounds. So b and p, d and t. Those sounds are really, really hard to hear the difference. So when they're learning new vocabulary or when they're listening to someone talk, they may confuse those sounds. So we have to think about how to teach our learners to support those issues that they may endure when they're hearing similar sounds. So oftentimes we need to think about how many words our students are listening to when they're first starting to learn a language. Now, leveled readers and also leveled listening tapes and CDs, auditory pieces are really, really important because they're going to scaffold how many words are in an audio file. And by doing this, students are not getting overwhelmed by too much vocabulary or too many sounds. Also, as teachers, we should always pre-teach the vocabulary and put an emphasis on the pronunciation and also on the grammar structures that they're going to hear so that they're familiar with it when they hear it. Now, listening exercises should consist of shorter stretches of talk time. We should not have students listening for 5-10 minutes. And we should also let them listen to it more than once. And we should add, after they've listened, we should add visual stimuli. We should give them something to connect it to. So they actually are able to build those pathways that we were talking about. So you can think about things like films, podcasts, photographs, because that offers students additional information and a different way to connect with their learning. And students generally do best when they first focus solely on listening. So we can let them listen to the audio piece that we want them to hear and have no other activities, not to fill in the blank, nothing. Just let them listen 1 or 2 times and then build upon that. Because what we're trying to do is build autonomous learners. And we're trying to build learners who have confidence in the classroom. When they're able to put all of their attention into listening and then build upon that, you're going to see better results. So those are just some strategies for teaching listening. Now, speaking. Speaking is an issue that can be difficult for students with learning differences, specifically dyslexia, because again, they have issues with sounds. So they may hear a word, recognize it, understand it, and then when it comes time for them to reproduce it, they have a really, really hard time with maybe the syllable structures, maybe how many syllables are in it, or maybe they'll confuse sounds that are very similar, as we talked about before, like p or b. And so that may be an issue for them. So we want them to be able to speak with confidence. So how do we do this? Well, here's a few strategies. We need to give students detailed instructions that outline what is expected from them in each step of the speaking activity. What is the focus of this activity? And as we do this, we need to give students ample time to practice. Talk time in the classroom is so important. And we don't necessarily need to focus on long utterances. When students are first learning a language, even if they can produce 1 or 2 words, helps them create these learning pathways. And it's very important to remember that group interaction is important, but not just working with the same partner that they usually work with. Yes, we want students to be comfortable with the people who they're speaking with, but we also need to think about collaborative learning models. And in doing so, we're able to get students to interact in different ways. So again, we need to think about how we're going to get students talking, what's important for them to know, and we need to make it fun. We need to think of materials that will support their overall learning and how people actually speak. Writing, so strategies for teaching writing. Writing activities so writing, generally speaking, for dyslexic learners is the hardest. It's the hardest for so many reasons. Part of it is we think faster than we can write. And I know that sometimes sounds crazy to people, but it's true. Think about how fast you think in your first language. Now think about if you're trying to connect that skill to your hand. You will lose grammar, and sometimes you may lose your idea. So writing activities are really hard at times. And also because English is not a phonetic language, it makes it even more difficult. So we should pre-introduce vocabulary and grammar that the students will need. And in doing this, we should help them with the structure. So we can do interactive mind maps. We can do interactive brainstorming. And then we can start from a very short, like a short sentence level task to bigger pieces. Now, I always say that I like my students to be able to at least at one point use a word processor. Now, people always look at me like, why? Why would you want your students to use a word processor? Computers can be very distracting. However, word processors, in my opinion, are a student with a learning difference's best friend because they help reduce issues with spelling, and they also help students see where they're having issues with their grammar structures. So that whole stress of being able to spell a word is reduced. Yes, sometimes students will still have issues spelling certain words. I understand that. But overall, it's reduced. Students can go back and see where they've made mistakes and correct it. And also, what's really great about a word processor is, generally speaking, students can type faster than they could write with a pen or a pencil. So because of this, word processors are really useful. And also, before I forget, word processors are great because they can change the font, they can change the brightness, and they can change the font size. So that helps when they have visual issues. And so I really recommend letting students use word processors. Also, one last point about writing activities. I think, in my experience working with learners with differences, that activities should be shorter, of course, and then larger activities, if you have to have them, break them into writing segments and scaffold them with other activities in the writing process, maybe finding visual stimuli to connect to what they're writing. This helps build those pathways that we're talking about. And also, because writing is such a hard thing to do, it gives them time to process their ideas and revisit and revise the information that they're presenting. So those are strategies for writing. Now finally, we're at reading. Reading is another very difficult area for students with learning differences, specifically dyslexia. And I think that pre-reading activities are essential for students with learning differences. We need to find ways to introduce or reintroduce vocabulary and grammar prior to having students read. And also, when we think about this, we need to get them talking before we get them reading because of that phonological disconnect. The issue with the phonological disconnect is when you haven't talked for a while, when you haven't experienced your mouth moving in another language, those sounds that you confuse, the rhythm of the language, the intonation, the stress, and just how we talk, it gets compromised. So usually when people, regardless if they have a learning difference or not, first start speaking in their second language, they feel like they've taken a step wrong, or that they're off a little bit. So if we do a speaking activity first and get them used to speaking, then they are able to speak clearly, and they're able to actually produce the correct intonation, and they're actually able to feel more confident. Because remember, reading is a multi-process. You have to be able to recognize words, you have to be able to recognize grammar structures, and then you have to be able to see that on a piece of paper and understand what that would actually sound like. So reading is a very, 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 very complicated skill. So if you do some sort of pre-reading activity, you're going to support your students' overall understanding. They're going to be able to see it. If you introduce the vocabulary and grammar prior to the reading activity, they'll be able to recognize it. So I really, really think that when you're doing text, you should use the same text over and over again. And I'm not saying you have to read the same paragraph or the same story, but it's good to have a story that has depth. It's good to revisit information and have it built upon. So you could be working on a short story and really cut it down to the first page. Have students do some sort of comprehension check afterwards, and to build on the knowledge that they already know. And this will help them when they're starting to do their writing activities, because they'll have something to connect it to. So try to use texts that take into account social and cultural pieces of information that are important to the language, the target language that they're learning, because it helps students gain a better understanding of themselves within this larger picture, and also it gives them purpose. Oftentimes we read texts that are not relatable, and let's be honest, if a text isn't interesting, we don't pay attention. And this has to do with many, many things. Sometimes this has to do with simply reading speeds, because you have to read at a higher speed to be able to comprehend the information on a page. So make it interesting, connect it with pictures, videos, and other stimuli. Give students a chance to talk about these pieces and connect it to something else. And also, another point I really want to make is that when you're thinking about these strategies, listening, speaking, writing, and reading, think about how you can combine these tools and build upon them. A lot of times as teachers, we feel like we should not use the same activities in the classroom every week. But if you have a game or you have an activity that really works, you should continue using that with different vocabulary, with different grammar, with different structures, because students aren't focused on learning the game or the activity. They actually become focused on the content. So I want to say, as I wrap up this webinar and we move into questions, that having a learning difference such as dyslexia is something that cannot be seen. It's invisible, and it is our job as teachers to create an environment where everyone has the opportunity to learn. I'm willing to take any of your questions. Thank you for participating in this webinar. And yeah, that's it.
All right, we had a couple questions come up throughout the webinar. First was going back to the suggestion that you gave on using word processors.
Okay.
Nudio wants to know of any suggestions that you have of what happens if the students don't have a computer or a device to use a word processor. Do you have a
Okay. So that's always an issue, right? I know that oftentimes in our teaching context, we don't always have computers. And for that, I think that often this is a solution that we can do is we can have this be a group project. Now, I know it's not always feasible, but even getting them to text on their phone or work on a project with those who have smartphones, even if they don't have Wi-Fi, we can still use Bluetooth. These are skills that happen. Now, oftentimes, if you don't have a word processor, yes, you're going to have to write. You're going to have to use a pen or a pencil. But I would always say in those cases, just get them brainstorming together. Don't be afraid to let them collaborate on writing projects. And when they're writing, you should not be afraid to support them and help them in the writing process as a mentor and also as a peer.
Uh, Two different questions came up from Maria del Rosario and also from Sylvia on evaluating students with learning
Ooh,
differences. If the
okay.
test should be easier, or what suggestions you have on evaluation.
Ooh, that's a really good question. And I've actually been developing a presentation on this because it's something that I really want to talk about. And evaluation is really hard, especially when students are undiagnosed. When students are undiagnosed, we cannot necessarily put accommodations into place. But if they're diagnosed, or if you're positive and you have permission from the people you work with, such as principals or coordinators, I say that extended test time, a different structure, so extended test time or letting them take the test in different parts, yes. Oftentimes, a larger font, I know this sounds silly sometimes to people, but a larger font, a clearer font will help students be able to see things. I've worked in the university system for a long time, and I've worked in the United States, and we were not allowed to alter the test information, right? Like we were not able to cut the amount of work down, but we were able to give them more time, and we were able to give them breaks in between the information. And we were also, like, if they were doing an auditory piece where they had to listen and then create sentences or fill in the blank, we allowed them to listen to it more. These are just starting points in the classroom. And I feel that anything that you can do and that you're comfortable doing and that your institution will let you do to support learners is the first step. I also think a second step in evaluation and assessment is talking to the student and teaching them how to identify their own issues. So being able to ask them what they need support in always helps them.
And there were two questions, but both similar, from Norma Alicia and also from Carla Maria about doing group work and about the dynamics of the group, about the classmates who are in the same group, if there should be different treatment or
Okay, yes. So as we all know, we need to think about groups and collaborative learning, and I think that the collaborative learning model is really, really useful when we're thinking about learning differences. We are going to have students who have stronger skills in reading and writing and listening and speaking. And when we think about that, and we also can see the skill set that our students with learning differences have as well. I think that we need to think about grouping. So if you go back to Krashen's I+1, people learn best from someone who has a little bit higher level or the same level as you. If there is a huge divide between in groups, it's going to be harder. But I also think that you should think about how you're scaffolding the groups. And I think that oftentimes when we're going back to the collaborative learning model, that you can have the home group that students are comfortable working in, but when you're focusing on listening or speaking and writing, that you can pair them differently. So the dynamic is always changing, and when you're looking at actual levels, think about two pieces. Psychologically, who is a student going to be comfortable working with, and what students are generally leaders but not going to disrupt the sense of self in the classroom with a student who has a learning difference. So I think for me, I like small group work, but I specifically like pair work because I like the partnership of letting people work together to balance what they know. But I also always try to make sure that they're not leaps and bounds different from one another, because that will create a dynamic in the pair group that is hard to overcome.
And Omar had a question on if you could clarify what exactly does it mean to have short stretches of talking time in the listening drills?
Ooh, good question. So short meaning, let's do this for a couple minutes, like 5-minute activities. If you're doing a listening activity, I don't think when you're first introducing something something that's solely based on what you're hearing should be more than 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes tops. And then I think afterwards, the speaking activity they can go really, really fast depending on what kind of groups you're having. So these, again, when you're thinking about first listening, then doing some sort of speaking activity. These can be 10 to 15 minutes. So let them listen to the audio once or twice and have a speaking activity and then scaffold it again. But allow them to listen to it. And I mean, I always check in with the students, all of the students, to see if people need to hear it more than once. And I know that that's not always a practice that we use, but oftentimes students will learn to speak up if they really had a hard time understanding.
And Laura had a question on, are there exercises that students can practice at home?
Are there exercises for learning differences that they can practice at home? Well, there's things such as eye yoga, which is just getting their eyes to actually focus and work together if they have dyslexia or dypraxia or something like specific language impairment, which literally is taking your finger and putting it in front of your hand or in front of your face as far away as you can get it, and stretching your eyes and putting it, making your finger move so you can't see it, but trying to focus on it from like the corner of your eye, for instance. But as for like activities, like writing, listening, speaking activities, I think they're the same activities that you already use, but having them maybe be shorter. And remember that the material that you're teaching them, the homework, should support that. So the activities that they're actually doing should be reproducing it, and it should not be teaching a new skill. New skills should be taught in the classroom.
Ta has a question, how can I support ESL students with learning differences who have heavy class demands?
How do you support students with learning differences who have, I wish I could ask you the question directly and find out what age you're teaching, but generally speaking, students need to build autonomy and they need to understand how they're learning in order to understand how to manage their time. For me, I teach one of my favorite workshops that I do on learning differences is looking at tools to actually help students become more organized. And so reminders on the phone, like one of my favorite free apps is Don't Forget the Milk. It works great. But putting reminders on your phone, checking in with notes, doing auditory notes, for instance, if they have a smartphone, and if they're able to record themselves speaking, letting them re-listen to those activities. But it's really thinking about time management and organizational skills.
And one question that's come up from a variety of people is, how do you know if a student has a learning difference?
So, as teachers, it is not our job to diagnose. However, I think there's often times that we can tell that students are learning at a different speed or having issues obtaining information. Oftentimes those issues are simple as flipping words, having issues, grammatical issues and structure that do not coincide with their first language. I'm not sure if that makes a lot of sense, but they're not necessarily, oftentimes when we see language learners, when they're making grammatical structures, those grammatical structures follow the grammatical issues when they're thinking about translating between their first and their second language. What I'm saying in this, that doesn't correspond, that the actual issues are repetitious and then there are issues that stem from them actually trying to process in their second language and making those issues. It's not a translating issue. But I often say that as teachers, it's a very intuitive process. And Maggie, I can email you a sheet that I usually send home with parents. So I have a worksheet that talks about problems that students may endure when they have a learning difference, and I often give it to the students. And if I'm working in K through 12, I also have them give it to their parents. And I do this to all students at the beginning of the class, and it's just a self-evaluation and then a family evaluation. And so it's things like, are they confusing sounds like p and b? Are they able to understand the grammar intuitively, but when it comes to applying it, they're having issues using it? Because that's often a telltale sign for a learning difference. And I can send you this. It's in English, so if you were to send it to a parent, you would need to translate it, or if you were to give it to a low-level student, you would need to translate it. But I'm more than willing to send that to you.
Yep, you can send that to me, and anyone who's interested could also just respond to me, and I can get the material. That leads into one other question that's come up from a few different people, and if you have suggestions for further resources, or websites or apps or anything where people could go for more information.
So you'll see that these two handouts that I included with you, are organizations that work with learning differences, and they talk about multisensory structured language teaching. These two handouts that are already provided for you are great. Also, Comos and Smith do incredible research in this area, and you'll notice, I'll just show you right now, right there are all my references. So you'll see that here, if you Google these names and these titles, you'll be able to find a lot of information. The Gilman Manual, which you'll see, is they talk about multisensory learning. They've been doing this since the 1950s. They're a leader in learning differences, but Nation is great. And also, you'll notice that I would say that the research that I find most interesting and I find most useful is coming out of the European Union, specifically the UK. And the reason why is they have more contact with language, and so they have a lot more tools that we don't always see in other parts of the world.
All right, and then I think about time for one more question was from Ruben, whose question was, I think, more from the perspective of the teacher on suggestions for how to use all of these strategies when you have limited time in the classroom.
Limited time and large student numbers, right?
Exactly.
Well, this is a question I get asked a lot, right? And I think that when we start thinking about listening, speaking, writing, and reading, and these strategies, look, I know we don't have a lot of time. I know our planación is really big, but I think that we have to repeat information to automatize it in all students' memories and make it so they can actually use it, right? We couldn't, for instance, teach the present progressive without reviewing the simple present tense of the to be verb. So we have to create avenues to do this. And we have to think about how these activities, again, are scaffold to support them. So oftentimes I say, if you start using a game and you see it successful, or an activity that's successful and you don't have to explain the rules over and over again, that saves you time. Every time you introduce a new way of teaching, students have to learn that, and also the grammar, and also the vocabulary. So finding a set of tools that you really like to use and scaffolding those and reusing them really, really supports this way of teaching. Also, I think that this doesn't detract from time. I think that these 4 listening, speaking, writing, and reading, these strategies for teaching are just that. They're strategies. So it's just finessing how you already teach.
All right, well, thank you, Rosie. It is 3 o'clock, so we are out of time. So if we do not get to your question, I apologize. Again, if you respond to me in the confirmation email that you got, I can get you any material that you weren't able to get. Also, any questions or comments you have are welcome. Again, for more information, you can contact us at RELO Andes at reloandes@state.gov. For more information, you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you can join us again next month.